From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We have a crisis here in the city of Benton Harbor, a water crisis. This water has been in a crisis longer than 3 years. They claim it's only 3 years. But the water crisis here is worse than the Flint, Michigan water crisis. They are poisoning the residents of Benton Harbor.
Officials in Michigan have warned residents in the predominantly black city of Benton Harbor to stop using tap water for drinking, cooking, or brushing their teeth due to lead contamination. The problem's been known about for years. Why is action only being taken now? We'll speak to the Reverend Edward Pinkney, the head of the Benton Harbor Community Water Council, also the pediatrician Dr. Hanna-Attisha, who helped expose the water crisis in Flint, Michigan 7 years ago.
Flint's crisis was not the first, the last, or the worst. The U.S. was stubbornly slow to respect science and didn't restrict the use of lead pipes until 1986. And we don't even know, but we think there's about 9 million lead lines in the country.
Plus, we'll speak to Dr. Mona about how the COVID pandemic is impacting children. And we'll look at the escalating tension between the United States and China.
While the West and Washington are not to blame for China's actions in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, when you have this overwhelmingly unified nationalist message that Washington is embracing around confronting China, this reinforces the same chauvinistic nationalist forces in China itself.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Mimi Goodman. West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin continues to thwart Democrats' attempts to pass an historic 10-year reconciliation package that would vastly expand the social safety net and combat the climate crisis. Manchin told the White House he opposes a key provision to replace coal and gas-fired power plants with renewable energy sources, a central pillar of the Build Back Better Act's climate plans. Senator Manchin's received more campaign donations from the oil, coal, and gas industries than any other senator. He's also earned millions from coal companies he created in the 1980s that his son now runs. As Manchin fights plans to curb the worst effects of the climate crisis, recently released data show his home state of West Virginia is more vulnerable to worsening floods than anywhere else in the United States. This comes as indigenous leaders and climate activists capped off a week-long protest in Washington, D.C. Friday with a march on the U.S. Capitol and a sit-in on Pennsylvania Avenue. They called again on President Biden to declare a climate emergency. Over 90 activists were arrested, bringing the total number of arrests during the week of action to 655. In more news about the stalled reconciliation package, Axios is reporting Senator Joe Manchin told the White House the plan's child tax credit must include a firm work requirement and an income cap around $60,000 per family. The expanded credit, which was passed in March in the American Rescue Plan, has lifted millions of American children out of poverty. Studies show extending the credit beyond 2021 would cut child poverty even further, reducing it another 40%. On Friday, Biden touted the Build Back Better Act's provisions for working families while visiting a child care center in Connecticut.
How can we compete in a world of millions of Americans' parents, especially moms, can't be part of the workforce because they can't afford the cost of child care or elder care, I might add. Elder care.
A Food and Drug Administration advisory panel unanimously approved booster shots for the one-shot Johnson & Johnson vaccine Friday. The second shot can be given as early as 2 months after the first dose. Federal regulators will now meet to decide whether to greenlight the panel's recent recommendations on J&J and Moderna boosters, as well as whether people should mix and match vaccines. Over 100 million people could be eligible for booster shots by the end of the week. A Bronx man who was imprisoned at the Rikers Island jail complex died on Friday from COVID-19, 1 hour after a judge granted him conditional release. 64-year-old Victor Mercado is the 13th person to die in a New York City jail this year. In international news, Britain's seeing a sharp rise in COVID-19 cases, with over 45,000 new infections reported Sunday. That's the highest daily number in the UK since mid-July. Russia is setting new daily records for cases and deaths, recording over 1,000 fatalities for the first time over the weekend. In Australia, the city of Melbourne is ending its lockdown this week after meeting its target of reaching a 70% vaccination rate. Melbourne has been under lockdown longer than any other city in the world. In neighbouring New Zealand, the country's largest city, Auckland, will extend its strict lockdown for another 2 weeks. The U.S. has offered to pay compensation to the families of 10 Afghan civilians who were killed in the August drone attack in Kabul during the final days of the U.S. occupation. 7 of the victims were children. The Pentagon initially said the strike averted an imminent threat by the Islamic State and made other false claims about the attack. The Pentagon, which did not specify the amount of the so-called condolence payments, also said it would assist family members who wanted to relocate to the United States. In other news from Afghanistan, the death toll from Friday's explosions at a mosque in Kandahar has risen to at least 47. The Islamic State Khorasan, known as ISIS-K, claimed responsibility for the attack. One local man lost loved ones at last week's attack, as well as the mosque attack in Kunduz 1 week earlier.
For how long should we live with blood and grief? What is our crime? Please share this with the entire world. We are Shiites, we are Afghans. What crime did we commit that we are offering so many sacrifices? A week ago, my brother got martyred in Kunduz. We did not go outside to earn money, but we came here for prayers this Friday. My brothers got martyred, the grandchildren got injured, an uncle got injured, another brother is injured. For how long? For God's sake.
In more news from Afghanistan, a government spokesperson said girls will soon be allowed to return to secondary schools after being told to stay home following the Taliban takeover. In the United Kingdom, a man fatally stabbed longtime British Member of Parliament David Arness Saturday as he met with constituents at a church east of London. The Metropolitan Police said they've arrested and charged a suspect in the killing, which they described as a terrorist attack. It was the first murder of a British MP since 2016, when anti-Brexit politician Joe Cox was fatally shot and stabbed by a far-right white supremacist. In Haiti, the U.S.-based group Christian Aid Ministries says 17 of its members and their family members, including 5 children, were abducted by a criminal gang Saturday as they were leaving an orphanage in Port-au-Prince. One of the members was Canadian, the rest U.S. citizens. They were based in Titayen, just north of Port-au-Prince. Human rights groups warn kidnappings in Haiti have tripled since the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse in July and a devastating earthquake in August. In labor news, the union representing television and film production crews has reached a tentative agreement with an association of Hollywood producers, averting a strike of some 60,000 workers just hours before a midnight deadline Saturday. The tentative deal brings members of the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, IATSE, higher pay, longer breaks, and better health care and pension benefits. Some union members are opposing ratification of the contract, saying it doesn't go far enough to prevent short turnarounds between work assignments. Immigrant justice advocates on Saturday walked out of a virtual meeting with the Biden administration to protest its plans to resume the contested Trump-era Remain in Mexico program, formerly known as Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP, by mid-November. Before leaving the meeting, advocates read a statement that said, quote, "It is not possible to make the inhumane humane, the unfair fair, or to breathe life into a deadly program. We refuse to be complicit in deterrence-based border policies," they said. The move comes after the Supreme Court in August revived Remain in Mexico. The program forced some 70,000 asylum seekers to wait in Mexico in often extremely dangerous conditions. The Financial Times reports China has test-fired a new nuclear-capable hypersonic missile in a launch that reportedly caught U.S. intelligence by surprise. China's foreign ministry denied the report. This comes as the Biden administration and its allies have taken a more aggressive military posture toward China. Last week, the U.S. and Canada sent warships through the Taiwan Strait, drawing condemnation from the Chinese military, which called the ships a threat to peace and stability in the region. That followed the incursion of about 150 Chinese warplanes into airspace claimed by Taiwan in early October. In Hong Kong, Chinese authorities have sentenced 7 more democracy campaigners to up to a year in prison over their roles in last year's protests against a national security law imposed by China. Among those sentenced were 2 former legislators and a leader of the Civil Human Rights Front, a group that led massive protests in 2020 but was disbanded in August amidst a police inquiry. In India, at least 26 people have died in massive landslides and floods triggered by days of torrential rains in the state of Kerala. Houses and bridges, some that connected to small villages, were also washed away. Some 180 rescue camps have been set up for more than 8,000 people who've been evacuated so far. An Argentine judge has indicted a former Spanish minister who served during the dictatorship of Francisco Franco in Spain on 4 counts of homicide. The judge also ordered the immediate arrest of Martín Villa, who lives in Madrid, but said it was unlikely to happen. Villa is accused of playing a key role in the brutal acts committed by Franco's right-wing regime, which ruled Spain until 1975, when Franco died. Tens of thousands of people were tortured, raped, killed, and disappeared. Yet, in 1977, Spain passed an amnesty law that pardoned crimes committed by the Franco dictatorship. Survivors and loved ones of Franco's victims have attempted to override the legislation by bringing many of these cases to courts in Argentina under international law. In Brazil, 2 indigenous Yanomami children drowned last week in a river where illegal gold miners operate. Yanomami leaders said the children, who were 7 and 5 years old, were sucked into a dredger machine as they were bathing in the Parima River. Brazilian officials allege the boys were carried away by the river's currents. Following the incident, Yanomami leaders, who for long have resisted illegal mining, deforestation, and the destruction of their territory, called on the far-right President Jair Bolsonaro to kick out the miners who've invaded Yanomami land, the largest indigenous reservation in Brazil. According to indigenous leaders, an estimated 20,000 illegal miners are currently in the region, polluting rivers with mercury that's used to separate gold from sand. In Puerto Rico, over 4,000 people took to the streets of San Juan Friday to protest ongoing and worsening power outages and increases in energy costs following the U.S.-imposed privatization of the electricity grid. Demonstrators chanted, "Get out, Luma," as they shut down traffic on a main highway. Luma, a U.S. and Canadian company, took over Puerto Rico's transmission and distribution of power in June. Residents of the island say the power cuts have damaged appliances and can be life-threatening to those who rely on certain medical machines. Earlier this month, California Congressmember Katie Porter grilled Luma CEO Wayne Stensby during a virtual hearing.
How many blackouts have been reported since Luma took over on June 1?
The system has a very large number of outages, Congresswoman, both before and after.
Can you count them? Is it so big you can't even keep track of them all?
There are outages every single day.
Congress members Porter and Raul Grijalva of Arizona have requested Luma turn over multiple documents by the end of this week. Texas is poised to enact a new anti-trans law after House Bill 25 passed both legislative chambers. The bill, which now heads to Republican Governor Greg Abbott's desk, would enact a ban on transgender youth participating in school sports. Former President Donald Trump is expected to sit for a video deposition today in a case that alleges his security guards assaulted protesters outside New York's Trump Tower in 2015. At least 10 civil cases are pending against Trump. In Georgia, jury selection starts today in the trial of 3 white men accused of murdering Ahmaud Arbery, an unarmed 25-year-old black man who was chased down and shot to death while out for a jog. Over the weekend, community members and Ahmaud Arbery's family gathered outside the Glynn County Courthouse for a pre-trial rally. Another rally is planned for today. Last month, former prosecutor Jackie Johnson was indicted and arrested for interfering with the investigation and trying to prevent the arrest of two of Arbery's killers, Greg McMichael, a former police officer, as well as his son Travis. And the family of Colin Powell says the former top U.S. general and former Secretary of State has died from COVID-19. He was 84 years old. He served as Secretary of State from 2001 to 2005 under George W. Bush. Powell, who was reportedly fully vaccinated, died at Walter Reed National Medical Center. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, we go to Michigan, where officials have warned residents in the predominantly black city of Benton Harbor to stop using tap water for drinking, cooking, or brushing their teeth due to lead contamination. The problem's been known about for years. Why is action only being taken now? Stay with us.
This old house might swallow us whole. Begins with our family, and soon it comes round to our soul. We're trying to grab hold of what we can't control. Always living on the edge. And that little heart, so full and complete.
Heavy as Lead by Layla Michaela. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Officials in Michigan have warned residents in the predominantly black city of Benton Harbor not to use tap water for drinking, cooking, or brushing their teeth due to lead contamination. Tap water in the cities contain lead levels up to 60 times the federal limit since 2018. Advocates are calling for officials to declare a state of emergency and for the EPA to intervene. Free cases of water are being given out to households, but some distribution sites don't have enough water to meet the demand. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer has now vowed to remove and replace lead pipes in the city within 18 months. Up until recently, Whitmer had been saying the process could take 5 years. The situation in Benton Harbor is being compared to the water crisis in Flint, Michigan that began in 2014 when the city's unelected emergency manager, appointed by then-Republican Governor Rick Snyder, switched the city's water supply to the Flint River as a cost-saving measure. The move has been linked to at least 12 deaths from an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease and widespread lead poisoning in residents, including children, in the majority black city of Flint. The water crisis in Benton Harbor comes as Congress is considering a $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill that includes $55 billion to replace lead pipes and for other measures to ensure drinking water supplies. We're joined now by two guests. Dr. Hanna-Attisha is a Flint-based pediatrician whose 2015 study revealed Flint's children had high levels of lead in their blood. And in Benton Harbor, Michigan, we're joined by the Reverend Edward Pinkney, president of the Benton Harbor Community Water Council, executive director of the Black Autonomy Network community organization. Reverend Pinkney, let's begin with you. Can you lay out the extent of the problem? You had top state officials like the governor coming in last Thursday to say they will deal with this. But this is a story, once again, like Flint, that has been going on for years.
Absolutely. And let me start at the very beginning, how all this came about. How it came about was that one of the Benton Harbor community members of the council took two jugs of water to the mayor of Benton Harbor to let him know that in this one square block, everybody's water was this color. And when they took it, he refused to even look at it. Once he didn't look at it, the Emma Kennard brought it to me, and I sent it to the University of Michigan Biological Lab to have it tested, and it came back with over 300 parts per billion of lead. That's how all this started. We went out and helped the city of Benton Harbor to test the water to make sure they have at least 60 samples. They had never had 60 samples at this time. So we went out and did it for them, which is so important, because if they don't have 60 samples, they'll just be out of compliance with the state. That's all it means. But if they have 60 samples, they can say that, whether the water is bad or not. So that was crucial. For 3 years, it was like this. Nobody said nothing. The elected officials, the governor officials, the EPA, nobody said a mumbling word. But what happened on September the 9th, we filed a petition. That petition was what you call a state of emergency with the federal government. And after filing that, things started to move. And which was so important, because if we had not filed that petition, we wouldn't be talking today, and it'll maybe be another 3 or 4 years that the resident of Benton Harbor will be drinking that tainted water, which is so crucial. The governor would have did exactly nothing without that petition. And also, this is an election year for her. So that is crucial. And let me say something about the bottled water that being distributed. And she's 30,000 cases is being distributed in Benton Harbor, but 25,000 is going to the surrounding areas. They are the ones coming to pick the water up. So that is a major crisis that we need to talk about also. You can't say that she's putting 30,000 cases of water into Benton Harbor, but she's allowing people from the surrounding area to come and pick the water up. And I'm very, very, very upset about that. I cannot believe that they didn't have a better system to make sure that everybody in Benton Harbor get fresh water.
Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, you were the one who blew open the story of the lead poisoning of the people of Flint. We're talking again about an overwhelmingly black city, Flint and Benton Harbor. Can you talk about what you feel the state and the federal government needs to do, and describe the crisis now in Benton Harbor?
Yeah. First off, Amy, it's great to be here with you, and it's great to be here with Reverend Pinkney. He has done heroic work to elevate this issue. So what the state and the federal government needs to do, and I was one of those folks that signed that petition, is to share very clearly and transparently in many different ways that the water is not safe right now, and to provide alternative water. And right now that's bottled water, and maybe it needs to be home delivered. We need to work with the community. We need to work with Reverend Pinkney and the folks on the ground to make sure that people have access to bottled water, because every day that goes by when there is lead in the water is one day too long for the children of Benton Harbor.
So describe what happened in Flint, the years as you expose this. This was under a Republican administration, under Governor Snyder. And then talk about what's happening in Benton Harbor.
Yeah, so Flint, as you mentioned earlier, was under this bizarre state of usurped democracy. We were under emergency management, and their goal was austerity to save money. And that's how our water source was changed in Flint, from the Great Lakes to the Flint River without proper treatment. So for about a year and a half, the people of Flint, like the people of Benton Harbor, were saying, hey, there's something wrong with my water. Please do something with my water. Moms would bring jugs of brown water to town hall meetings, and they would be dismissed and denied for a long time, until finally, we brought science to the table that kids were in harm's way. And it took a while. There was a bit of backlash, but the state finally conceded. And now in Benton Harbor, we have amazing folks that are also sharing, hey, there's something wrong with our water. And also, interestingly, Benton Harbor was also one of the cities in Michigan that lost democracy, was also another city that was under emergency management. And if you remember, in Michigan, at one point, half of our African-American population was under emergency management, where there was unelected, unaccountable officials that were running these cities. And let this be another lesson of the consequences of taking away people's democracy and taking away their voices. It impacts health. So in Benton Harbor, there wasn't a water switch. It's hard to tell when their crisis happened. But for 6 consecutive sampling periods, which is about 3.5 years, the lead in their water has exceeded the EPA action level. And that EPA action level is not even a health-based standard. It's just a compliance standard. So that's even an underestimation of the amount of lead that has been in the water and the potential harm that it could be doing.
Reverend Edward Pinkney, if you can talk about the 2 towns. Alex Kotlowitz eloquently wrote about it years ago in a book called The Other Side of the River, a story of 2 towns, a death in America's dilemma. It's a story of overwhelmingly African-American Benton Harbor and the white, wealthier St. Joseph. Talk about the difference.
There's a major difference here. When you talk about St. Joseph, Michigan, they have nice, clean water. But at one time, they got their water from the city of Benton Harbor. Let me say this. Racism plays a major part in this. And when I talk about it, can you imagine a white woman with a baby getting on the camera in front of the news media telling people that they had 889 parts per billion of lead in their water and it's killing her baby? They will send out the Army, FEMA, the Pentagon, and all these different things. But since it's Benton Harbor, a black city, that they figure that, that this can continue. If we had not filed that petition, and I thank Dr. Mona for joining us with that, because that was tremendous. We wouldn't even be talking today about this, because this is one thing that they allow Flint, Michigan, Benton Harbor, in their eyesight, it's all right, but it's not all right. We have to change and let them know that no city in the United States of America should be suffering from water. Water is life. You cannot live without water. And the racism that exists on this part is outstanding, because nobody really cares. You see, nobody cares about Benton Harbor. Nobody cares about Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan's still having the same problem they had years ago. But we have to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to do to make sure this never, ever, ever happen to another city.
Many top state officials were indicted for what happened in Flint. For example, the governor, Rick Snyder, ultimately was indicted. Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, if you can talk about what took place and explain what lead poisoning does and why children are particularly vulnerable.
Yeah, I'll start with that. So, when I heard about the possibility of lead in Flint's water, that's when my heart stopped, my life changed, because as a pediatrician, we know what lead does. It's a irreversible, potent neurotoxin. It especially impacts developing children. It erodes cognition, so it actually lowers IQ levels. It impacts behavior and development, causing learning problems, attention problems, focusing problems, causes growth problems and hearing problems. And we now know that kids exposed to lead can present later on in life with things like high blood pressure and kidney disease and gout, and even things like early dementia and Alzheimer's. Incredible science has taught us that, especially over the last few decades, that there is no safe level of lead. None. Zero. Levels we thought were okay, decades ago, we now know are not okay. And what we're supposed to be doing, what the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics and the World Health Organization recommends, is this concept of primary prevention. We are supposed to find lead in the environment before children are exposed. Yet, for decades and maybe centuries, we have failed at this. We have lacked the political will to dig up those lead pipes, to fix up the old homes where there's still lead paint, to clean up the soil where we have remnants of lead and gasoline, and protect our children, and especially our most vulnerable children. Lead is a classic form, like Reverend Pinkney mentioned, of environmental racism, and we've known that also for decades. It continues to be children who are predominantly poor, but predominantly people of color who are disproportionately burdened by environmental contamination like lead. Flint kids, just like Detroit kids and Chicago kids and Benton Harbor kids and Philadelphia kids, these are kids that already have higher rates of lead and are also already burdened with so many other toxicities of life that make it hard for them to be healthy and succeed. So if we are serious about being anti-racist, if we are serious about eliminating inequities, one of the first things that we should be doing is getting rid of the lead in our environment. And I'm hopeful that the infrastructure bill will finally get rid of these poisonous, and you can think of them as straws. Like, our children have been drinking through poison straws across this country. Flint was just the tip of the iceberg. And I probably spent half my time working with other communities because the story keeps repeating. And I hope this story in Benton Harbor is the last story. And we can make it the last story if we finally pass the infrastructure bill.
Well, I want to thank Reverend Edward Pinkney for joining us, president of Benton Harbor Community Water Council. And Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, I'd like you to stay on as we move to the issue of COVID. You're a pediatrician in Michigan and co-chair of the Protect Michigan Commission. And I wanted to ask you about vaccines for children as well as the pandemic in Michigan. While much of the country is seeing a drop in coronavirus cases and hospitalizations, the pandemic has continued to worsen in Michigan, with the highest rates of infection reportedly among 10 to 19-year-olds. This comes as the Biden administration is launching a national vaccination campaign for about 28 million children between the ages of 5 and 11. Pfizer's COVID vaccine is already being given to children as young as 12 in the U.S., and the company says a 2-dose vaccine that's 1/3 as potent as the original vaccine is safe and effective for younger kids. This is President Biden speaking last week.
We have purchased enough vaccines for all children between the ages of 5 and 11 in the United States. And it'll be convenient for parents to get their children vaccinated at trusted locations. And families will be able to sleep easier at night knowing their kids are protected as well.
Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, this comes as Michigan has seen low vaccination rates since vaccines were made widely available for adults about 10 months ago. Now Michigan's seeing more than 3,500 new coronavirus cases a day, 3 times the daily average of a year ago. Last year, armed militants attacked the Michigan Capitol, threatened to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer in a plot that stemmed from restrictions she put in place to protect Michigan residents from the coronavirus. Just last month, she reached a budget deal with state lawmakers that includes language that would prevent her from implementing COVID-19 vaccine mandates and mask rules for K through 12 students. Can you talk about the situation in Michigan?
Yeah, so, as the rest of the country is starting to see a decrease from the Delta variant, Michigan is now starting to see that surge from Delta. As we know, Delta is more contagious, and now it is this unvaccinated population, largely unvaccinated, of young children and young adults that are increasing in cases. It's frustrating in Michigan. The governor's hands are largely tied because of the restrictions from both the Michigan Supreme Court and the Michigan legislature. It's hard, and I continue to be in disbelief. And there's so many resonance here to the Flint story. Like, why wouldn't you want to protect people? Like, why would you want to tie the arms of public health? This is a moment where we need good governance. We need leaders to do the hard things and to be driven by science. And unfortunately, there's so much opposition. And, Amy, just like, our public health leaders are under attack. And, my inbox is often filled with anti-science messages. And, from the times of Flint, but now also with kind of the anti-mask movement and the anti-vaccine movement. And now those messages are filled with vitriol. They include racist messages and sexist messages. So it is very difficult to be a public health leader right now. But as a pediatrician, we are super excited about the imminent authorization of the vaccine for younger children.
So let's talk about masks and vaccines. K through 12 schools without mask mandates in Michigan saw 62% more coronavirus spread. Now you have the possibility that children can be vaccinated. Can you just, for the science of it and for people who are deeply concerned about vaccines, explain why you think that children being vaccinated is critical to stemming this pandemic?
Absolutely. So, and I cannot wait for those conversations that we have already been having in our exam rooms. As pediatricians, all we do is give vaccines. This is bread and butter of what we do every single day. And I want moms and dads to come into the office with questions. And we talk science. We talk about the safety and we talk about the efficacy specifically of the COVID vaccine. And this is an amazing vaccine. It works really, really well, better than so many other vaccines that we have. And it most importantly protects from serious illness and it protects from death. So we have those conversations and we answer questions. And once again, families have questions as they should. I don't want them to blindly trust what I have to say. I want that trust to continue to be built in those one-on-one conversations. And we might not convince them at that first visit, but we might at the second visit and we might at the third visit. So I talk about the science. I talk about how the benefits greatly outweigh any potential risks. And what I often do in those exam visits is I also share that I trust this vaccine so much that my own children have gotten this vaccine. So my kiddos are in the 12 to 15 age group. And the very first day it was authorized for that age group, I had them on live TV getting their vaccine. I mean, I don't think we should all be using our children to help people get protected, but my kids wanted this is the first vaccine, the first shot that they were begging for because they want to go back to normal. They want to go back to school. They don't want to be quarantined. They want to be children. And our children, even though we haven't had many deaths, they have lost so much. They have lost parents. They have lost, time in education. There's been a huge impact on mental health. So it's really important if we want to go back to normal for our kids to get this vaccine.
I'm looking at a piece in The Guardian which says to help states and cities prepare, the CDC sent out a 7-page document with guidance on how to set up expanded vaccination programs. It notes that pharmacies in every state can give COVID shots to children, but that only doses prepared and packaged specifically for children are to be used for those under 12. Explain the importance of that, Dr. Mona.
Yeah, so the dosing is smaller than the regular dose of the Pfizer vaccine. There's also different storage issues and the number of vials. So it's, I strongly believe, and the American Academy of Pediatrics strongly believes, that kids should go to their medical home, which is their regular doctor, to get that vaccine. Because once again, we have a trusted relationship. We are finding that the role of trust is huge in COVID and in people's acceptance of this vaccine. So going to the place where you usually go to get vaccines, getting your questions answered, and having it prepared in a place specifically, once again, where they know what to do with childhood vaccines.
Advocates also calling for the government to do more to address racial disparities and obstacles that might emerge in vaccinating younger children. For example, kids may not get shots if parents can't get off work.
Yeah, we absolutely have to address those barriers. There's those who are vaccine hesitant and there's those who are vaccine resistant. And we can have, we can work to address the vaccine hesitancy by overcoming those barriers, which in medicine we often call the social determinants of health, addressing things like childcare and missing work and having evening hours and getting transportation. We need all hands on deck to improve our vaccination rates, and it includes addressing all these other barriers to healthcare.
Well, Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, I want to thank you for being with us, pediatrician based in Flint. Her 2015 study revealed Flint's children had high levels of lead in their blood. She's a Michigan State University professor, co-chair of the Protect Michigan Commission. She's also author of What the Eyes Don't See, a story of crisis, resistance, and hope in an American city. Also, to see our coverage of the Flint water crisis, you can go to democracynow.org to check out our documentary, Thirsty for Democracy, The Poisoning of an American City. Next up, we look at the escalating tension between the United States, China, and Taiwan. Stay with us. China Gates by Yuja Wang. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show looking at U.S.-China relations and the growing tensions between China and Taiwan. China's military has condemned the United States for sending Navy warships through the Taiwan Strait last week, accusing it of stoking regional tensions. U.S. allies Britain and Canada have also sent ships through the strait. This comes after China's recently conducted repeated Air Force missions in Taiwan's air defense zone. For more, Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez and I spoke to Ethan Paul, research associate at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, former reporter with the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong. His recent piece headlined, "Biden Doesn't Understand the New Cold War." Today, we bring you part two of our conversation. I started by asking Ethan Paul about the CIA's plans to set up a new mission center focused solely on China, with CIA Director William Burns describing China as, quote, the most important geopolitical threat facing the United States.
Well, Nicholas Burns announced that the China Mission Center would be set up in the CIA, which would help frame the agency's overall approach, not only to China, but to its overseas operations in general. I would say two things on this front. Number one is that this is only the latest step by the Biden administration and going back to the Trump administration in a broader effort to transform the federal government itself, to reorient itself around so-called competition with China. We have seen new institutions, new offices, new organizations be created in the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, which has been accused of profiling Asian and Chinese Americans, the Department of Commerce, and most recently, the State Department and the CIA. And so I think, in thinking through what is going on here, I think the metaphor I continuously come back to is the federal government's response to 9/11 and the global war on terror. What we saw in the years after that was a similar transformation. You saw the Department of Homeland Security be created. You saw powers be expanded for the NSA and other agencies. And not only were these powers ultimately abused, but it kind of creates a momentum within the federal government itself that makes it difficult to reassess and think about, should we, withdraw from Afghanistan or Iraq? Are we winning? I worry that we're going to end up making these same mistakes as we set out on this so-called competition with China. The second quick point I would make is that not only is this transformation happening, but I have seen little to no meaningful dissent among Democrats in the Congress concerned about, are there any, will there be any abuses of power here? Will the CIA and State Department be setting their own China policies? There has been no statements from congressional Democrats talking about oversight and the need to make sure that we don't let this beast run out of control. This is very concerning to me.
And Ethan, when they talk, when our leaders talk about the geopolitical threat of China, are they talking about China? Are they really talking about China threatening the United States, or are they talking about China challenging the continued world supremacy of U.S. economic power? Because it doesn't seem to be that there's anything that's going to be able to stop China at this point from eventually surpassing the economic production power of the United States, if only because it has four times the population of the United States, and it is increasingly technologically advanced.
Sure. So, I think you can look at the world and see very clearly that China itself is not a threat to the United States. China has no military bases in our backyard, no alliances, and we have these two wide oceans on our left and right, and weak neighbors to our north and south. We are incredibly safe, And you're right. What China is, in fact, challenging is America's 75 years of global dominance. Not only economically, but also in the Asia Pacific. China has undergone a massive military modernization campaign over the last few decades, But at the end of the day, this was inevitable. As countries like China and India rose and started to take on a greater share of global economic growth, they were inevitably going to balance and push back against the United States. The key question we need to ask ourselves is how are we going to ensure that this process ends well, particularly for everyone in Asia. I have not seen many Americans in Washington asking themselves these questions, and so I worry we're starting on an open-ended, uncertain where we are headed competition that is really about containing something which cannot be contained, which is China's economic and political influence.
And could you talk about the Republican Party's transformation on this issue? After all, it was Richard Nixon who initially normalized relations with China, and many Republican back or corporations have benefited over the past 50 years from opening up the China market. Yet you have people like Tom Cotton, Nikki Haley, Marsha Blackburn, and other Republican leaders increasingly demanding more confrontation with China.
Sure. So I think, parts of the Republican Party are searching for what their post-Trump identity might look like. And I think there's a significant portion, including the ones you mentioned, but also people like Congressman Mike Gallagher, Senator Josh Hawley. There's a clique in Congress that is basing their identity on confronting China. And, I think this is for a couple of reasons. One is because it gives, the vision of American hegemony and primacy a new lease on life, a new reason to continue existing. It also allows Republicans to play up the racial conflict, which I think was at the heart of Trump's presidency. But at the end of the day, this goes beyond just the Republican Party. We are also seeing among organizations like Fox News and other right-wing media outlets a similar embrace of China as a new central theme of their identity and their critique of the left here at home. What I would say is that I think this presents the greatest danger for the U.S. and China going forward. And what I mean by that is, if a Republican president is inevitably elected in a few years, I think they're going to turn the institutions that Biden and Trump left them and turn up the heat on China, because China has been baked into their political identity. And so when you see, a possible President Cotton, President Haley, President Blackburn, if they were to do something such as recognize Taiwan unilaterally, or some other destabilizing action that moves away from the status quo, that's when we would really see U.S.-China relations take a hot turn. I'm not so worried under Biden. I am more worried about, the direction the Republican Party is taking it and will take it when they get back into power.
Can you explain what the Taiwan Relations Act is?
Yeah, so in 1979, the U.S. and China established diplomatic relations. And for that to happen, the United States said, okay, we no longer recognize Taipei as the government of China. We now recognize Beijing, and we acknowledge that the two sides have this political disagreement and would like to see it peacefully reunified. At the same time, there were some promises made to Beijing about removing American troops, removing the Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan, lowering arms sales over time, etc. And so what the Taiwan Relations Act was the congressional response to the deal that Washington cut with Beijing. Congress looked at it and said, we don't like this. We think this sells Taiwan out. And so the Taiwan Relations Act dictates, what the United States, what U.S. policy towards Taiwan has been since it was passed in the 80s. And that involves maintaining unofficial diplomatic relations with Taiwan, continuing to sell it military equipment, and being very concerned if there were to be a unilateral change across the status quo. This is the foundation which has kept the stability across the Taiwan Strait for the last 40 years. It is now being eroded by both Beijing and Washington. And I think this is the hottest flashpoint for the two sides going forward.
And can you talk about the transformation taking place in the U.S. federal government, in DOD, the Pentagon, CIA, Department of Justice, reorienting themselves, focusing much more on China and what this means for policy and possibly from Cold War to hot war?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, we've seen, going back to the Trump administration, we saw various parts of the federal government transform themselves. The Department of Defense opened a new office specifically focused on China. The Department of Justice and the FBI started what's called the China Initiative, which seeks to ferret out so-called Chinese influence in academic and research institutions. We saw the Department of Commerce, really bolster its focus on China during the trade war. And now during the Biden administration, we've seen the State Department announce new offices and institutions focused on China. And most recently, we've seen the CIA. And so when the federal government is a massive institution, and so when all of these transformations are happening simultaneously, it creates a momentum in policy, very similar to the momentum we saw in the global war on terror and in things like the war on Afghanistan, that makes it very difficult for dissenting voices to be heard, for alternative perspectives on the relationship to be engaged, and ultimately for U.S. policy to be changed. But I would also note that this goes beyond just the federal government. You can also look at the Air Force and the military-industrial complex. They are also increasingly embracing China as a central part of its message. Air Force Secretary Kendall is very famous for saying that the weapons he wants are designed to scare China. Companies like Lockheed Martin have embraced great power competition as a way of selling the need for continued funds from Congress. And beyond that, we've seen a new up-and-coming and legacy journalists and intellectuals. We've seen tech companies. We've seen academics all almost overwhelmingly embrace this overall confrontational message that is being created around China. And there is little to no, and I cannot emphasize this enough, there is little to no meaningful dissent about the direction that U.S. policy is being taken, what our goal is, how we're going to maintain stability and peace in Asia over the long term. And, this is particularly a problem, in my view, among Democrats in Congress, in the House and Senate. I know of no Democrats who have staked out a meaningful dissent position on China. There's been hundreds of bills introduced seeking to escalate tensions. I know of no bills that have been introduced seeking to relax or manage them. And so until the Democratic Party wakes up, there will be no one in Washington who will be able to resist this. And I think they might wake up when it's too late.
And I wanted to ask you, how do progressives and supporters of human rights, how are they able to support or oppose the crackdowns on democracy activists in Hong Kong and the actions of China against the Uyghurs, while at the same time opposing the belligerence and the confrontational policies toward U.S.-China relations?
Sure. So, I think anyone who wants to see a world that isn't defined by a new Cold War needs to take the direction that China has headed under Xi Jinping very seriously. I think I lived in Hong Kong for a year after the national security law took effect, and I saw for my own eyes how civil society that had long existed in that city was being smothered slowly, day after day. In Xinjiang as well, we've seen a massive, what I would consider a crime against humanity take place. But at the end of the day, we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to be able to say, look, China, Beijing is increasingly brutal in how it treats places like Xinjiang and Hong Kong and also Taiwan. At the same time, the kind of escalatory path that we are headed on offers no future for the world. And also, I would add that while the West and Washington are not to blame for China's actions in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, when you have this overwhelmingly unified nationalist message that Washington is embracing around confronting China, this reinforces the same chauvinistic nationalist forces in China itself. And, that can contribute to an environment where China does continue to crack down in places like Xinjiang and Hong Kong. I would say going forward, we need to kind of have a Hippocratic oath. We need to find the best ways of adapting and mitigating the kind of rights abuses that China is doing without making the situation worse. And I'll give you one example. In the Strategic Competition Act that the Senate passed, there are calls to liberalize America's visa policy towards Hong Kong. And this, to me, would be a significant step. Steps that countries like Australia, the UK, Canada have already taken and have more robust policies towards. At the same time, there's also provisions in the bill that seek to allocate a couple $2 million to promoting democracy in Hong Kong. Avoiding this kind of outward appearance of interfering in what China views as its core internal affairs is, we need to avoid doing stuff like that because it only, securitizes Hong Kong in the eyes of Beijing, and it only provides further justification for people like the Hong Kong Security Force to crack down in Hong Kong. And so I think we need to think about how, we can adapt to China's growing rights abuses and the inevitability of its power without doing further harm to those we're trying to help.
That's Ethan Paul, research associate at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. We'll link to his article, Biden Doesn't Understand the New Cold War. To see part one of our discussion, go to democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is currently accepting applications for 2 full-time jobs, a director of finance administration and a human resources manager. Go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Stay safe, wear a mask, save lives.